Prosecutors say they believe the suspect in the killing of a Palermo man last year wrote a note that included a diagram of the victim's property and detailed actions he planned to take. The new information in the case against 59-year-old Kirby Bradford of Liberty came to light during a hearing in an Ellsworth courtroom today.
Bradford is charged with the murder in the death of 56-year-old Robert Brusso. Brusso was found dead outside his boots and Saddle Road home last April following a welfare check.
According to court documents, it's believed Brusso was killed on February 8th. Bradford pleading not guilty to both the murder charge and possession of a firearm by a prohibited person.
Today, a judge ruled that 2 charges would be separated and Bradford will have 2 trials. The judge also ordered Bradford to submit a handwriting sample to compare against the note.
In a garage bay of a workspace which multiple people would testify belonged to and was used by Mr. Bradford, and I believe on information and belief that certain people would say that that was exclusively used by him, police found trash. In that trash was a written note that contained a relatively detailed, I don't want to overstate, but a relatively detailed diagram of the victim's property and a list of things that whoever wrote the note, a jury could reasonably infer was a list of either things to get or actions to accomplish, such as stun gun, bring him someplace out of sight, zip ties.
The defense asked the court at this point to deny the motion, or in the alternative, request strict limits. Neutral text that is approved by the court in advance. What happens if the handwriting sample is, "I did it, I killed him"? That doesn't seem appropriate to the defense, or some other thing that is inappropriate that would bias the jury.
Bradford's being held without bail at Kennebec County Jail, where he was being held on unrelated charges at the time of his arrest for Brusso's killing.